This is a sparring program, similar to the programmed reality of the Matrix. It has the same basic rules like gravity. What you must learn is that these rules are no different than the rules of a computer system. Some of them can be bent. Others can be broken. Understand? Then hit me, if you can. Good. Adaptation, improvisation. But your weakness is not your technique.
Morpheus is fighting Neo.
People don't think about how hard it is to be a podcaster.
It's not that.
You got to think about the podcasters.
I mean, it's harder for you because you do all the work.
You got to think about the podcasters. Hello and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Doesn't believe he could land a commercial airliner with clear instructions over the radio, Maddox.
I have been told by so many people that know stuff about stuff that it is so much harder than you think, and most people could not do it. I guess your argument is maybe you're not most people, but...
I don't think either of us are most people, to be clear. But no, I think I could do it for sure.
Okay.
I feel a little vindicated that I texted my friend, who is a licensed certified pilot, and he said he could 100% do it, and also I could 100% do it. I don't think 100%
But he flies
is safe.
like Cessnas, and I've heard that even people that are just like moving between different versions, like Boeing versus Airbus, is like a huge, huge hurdle, and it's not a thing that you can just do on a whim.
I mean, I'm not saying do it on a whim. I'm saying in a life or death situation.
That's what a whim is, right?
I'll do it on God's whim. His argument was that things happen very slowly in a big airplane. Inertia is somewhat to your favor. You know, you get to make adjustments slowly. It's not like you're going to fall out of the sky immediately because you got a lot of mass moving. I don't know. I think I could do it. Not 100%.
Not 100%, so you'd land and they'd be like, hey, buddy, you got 85% here. What'd you do with the other 15?
Well, to be clear, I'm talking about a survivable landing.
It must still be up there. Sorry,
I'm talking about a survivable landing. I'm not promising that plane's going to be good to go.
Okay.
I just think I could walk away from it. And I'm not 100% confident. I would say I'm over 50% confident.
Not 100%, only like 98% confident.
My sister brought up this discussion topic. The second time, I'm certain I could do it. I thought the first time you might learn something that behaves a little differently than you expect. I mean, to be fair, I think this really comes down to how good are the instructions over the radio.
I'm confident that if I don't survivably land it the first time, I will also not fail a second time. That's what I can say.
Careful
with
construction
100%
there.
confidence.
Careful construction. I mean, really, it comes down to how good the instructions are, and I'm assuming they're excellent. I need excellent instructions, but I think I could sort through it. But then, I said I thought I could land a plane. My whole family was like, "You're the worst. You're an overconfident man. Men always think they can do this stuff they can't do." And then I texted my pilot friend. He said, "Actually, I could totally do it." He is a man,
Yeah,
though,
another
so you
man.
never know. Another man. Mm-hmm. Then we had the question. My sister actually wanted the room to answer, or maybe it was my brother-in-law. What percent of people know more about airplanes than me among the adult population of the United States? And I was very touched that you only said 4%.
I mean, we did a pre-discussion. We opened the floor for questions. What does it mean to know about airplanes? And we kind of said it was very broad. You know, how does rubber on tires get made? How do windows get sealed? Just like the basic principles, mechanics of lift, like anything about an airplane. And I think most people just like they watch football.
I think most people know nothing.
Enjoy their, hobbies, and they do their work.
You say they watch football. It sounds like you're saying all the dum-dums are watching football. I mean, people are not...
No, I think your hobby is reading Wikipedia to a large extent and watching videos about engineering disasters. So I feel like you know a lot of stuff that most people would not because it just doesn't interest them.
Yeah, I think I'm below anybody that studied anything about airplanes formally.
Absolutely.
But that's a pretty small chunk of the population.
Or even like cars or bicycles.
I think I'm also below like most engineers or mechanics of pretty much any trade.
But what percentage of the population is that? Like, Half a percent, maybe?
I don't know. Not a big chunk of the population.
Not a lot.
I guess about 11%, but I was touched by your 4%. Meant a lot
Maybe
to
I
me.
went a little too far.
Meant a lot to me. Thank you for the compliment, I say. He says, I probably shouldn't have been so
Went
nice.
too far, he would have been happy with 6.
I did ask this question to some friends at the pool, and they were like, "Oh, I know nothing about airplanes." They were like, "I'm bottom 30% of knowledge about airplanes."
Yeah,
which I don't know.
they might even be wrong too.
I guess. I mean, I'm sure we're all wrong about everything, but I do have a fascination and interest in how things work.
I've listened to multiple podcasts about the history of airline food. Does that give me anything?
I mean, it's something.
It's on the airplane.
Better
so it
than
counts.
nothing. I think airline food has caused more plane crashes than a lot of things that are also have to do with airplanes.
No.
Probably at some point, some pilots have not been poisoned by airline food. Has that never happened?
Don't they always have to eat, the pilot and the co-pilot have to eat 2 different meals?
That was since one specific incident.
Yeah, smart.
But in that incident, pilots did not get sick, miraculously. Anyway. This is a bit of a potpourri episode. I think we're mostly going to talk about my Neoclassical Cube, which is my old school cube that plays some non-old school cards. I've been running drafts of it in a few back-to-back weeks at the local Cube night. In the lead up to Steel City Cube, which is a Cube event happening in Pittsburgh, a week from when this episode comes out, that the Cube will be featured at. And so I wanted to get a little more qualitative analysis in, a little more opinions about the Cube, and I've been cutting it down to 360 from a little over 400 for a while before I actually take it out to Pittsburgh to give it to a bunch of strangers and see what they do with it. So I have some thoughts about that. Hopefully it's interesting just to talk through normal Cube design thoughts and process.
Yeah,
we talk about the meta stuff so much, but I think just here's what I'm actually doing leading up to an event, I think is maybe interesting.
Definitely. I think this is a very unique environment that you've put a lot of particular thought into that just, goes beyond even just like, how do we roughly balance the archetypes and what kind of themes are fun for me? It goes pretty deep. And I expect this to be really popular at Steel City Cube because it's both very novel but nostalgic at the same time, or at least there's a clear sort of hook to it about what the Cube is without being something totally weird like the Turbo Cube, which admittedly there's a very reasonable reason not to be interested in something that is that off the wall.
Yeah, you hate fun. Yeah, I guess I feel like old school environments tend to be popular. I'm thinking back to like the Old Border Foil Cube at CubeCon in the first year was like the most popular cube in the roster. We were listening to some friends play a game of Canadian Highlander last night.
Oh my god, at a certain point.
I'm so I think a lot of people are like subconsciously drawn to old school Magic because it is grokkable. It is simple compared to modern Magic. I mean, like literally these were 2 experienced players, very experienced players that were playing at Canadian Highlander decks they were relatively new to, so they didn't have a bunch of experience with these specific decks, but there was just so many questions about what happens with this initiative card and how does this work? What was the specific question about?
I don't even know. I just at some point I turned around, I was just like, are you guys playing Judge's Tower? Because you've just been having this discussion about how the rules work with every card you're casting.
Every card that was casted was like, how does this work with that?
This is the first time I've cast this initiative card, and I'm doing this thing during this triggers at the beginning of first main phase.
There was a lot of questions about opposition agent and opposition agent and exactly what that did, which, to be fair, that is somewhat complicated. There was like, and again, these were experienced players. They had reasonable questions like, it says you control a player while they're searching their library, and anything they find you exile. But it's not entirely clear they can't still find it in exile, but they can't. Like, it's like dumb things like that, just in the aggregate, like 2 decks just like, for those who don't know, Canadian Highlander is a singleton format that uses a point system instead of a ban list. So I think only like, Shahrazad and stuff are banned, but you can put power in your deck if you want, but you only have a certain number of points. I think it's 11. Don't quote me on any of this to basically build your deck out. But the result is you're basically playing like very, very powerful singleton decks that like resemble either a constructed legacy or vintage deck or like a CEDH deck, like really powerful cards. And because it's a competitive format, you, unlike Cube, are not going to be like, I'm not going to put Minsc and Boo in my deck because that doesn't make sense. Like one of the decks that was being played last night was Jeskai Green, and I was like, oh, is it like a Jeskai Ascendancy deck that's playing a bunch of mana dorks? That's like the one way I can think of calling a deck Jeskai Green. They're like, no, it's just a Jeskai deck that plays Oko and Minsc and Boo and all the broken planeswalkers. I'm like, of course, that makes a lot more sense. Anyway, it was interesting listening to them spend so much time discussing the rules, and they were not having a bad time. I think they were having a good time figuring this out. It's not like it was a bad experience for them per se, but definitely very different than old school Magic. And I think a lot of people are kind of drawn to it.
Old school Magic where you just have to worry about layers, easy stuff that's fun and enjoyable for the whole family.
Look, I do have humility in the cube. It's just the one card that's complicated.
I only had one humility issue come up last night, so that's good.
The humility player said that was the only one that came up all evening.
Excellent. You love to see it.
Also, was the question just as mobilization give the tokens vigilance? Was that the issue?
Yes.
Or was it something different?
Yeah.
That's barely even an issue. Barely
it mattered.
Even an issue.
It made a big difference on the board. Not really. I was losing big time.
Yeah, when they've got mobilization and you've got creature spells you're casting.
Yes, and importantly,
with humility in play, that's not great.
They had 3 unanswerable enchantments, and I had 3, and yeah, I had 2 disenchants. It was fine.
Anyway, I think people are drawn to old school Magic because you can actually know what's going on. That's my little projection for the subconscious trend towards people liking old school Magic. And it's certainly a big part of why I like it.
Yeah,
very, very big part of why I like it. So anyway, before we get to that though, first let's do a quick check-in about the Beauty of Games book club, because we are still doing this. We haven't mentioned it in the past couple episodes because we forget. We don't have a producer for this show. It's just me, and I forget to do these things. We have agreed to have Parker on to discuss it, and Parker is going to be in town in Baltimore for SCG Baltimore in the coming weeks, which means that the episode for the Beauty of Games is going to come out on July 29th, and we're going to solicit... I'm not going to call it hot takes. This doesn't feel hot take appropriate.
Reasonable takes.
I'm going to solicit
conversation. If you have if you read the book and you have an interesting thought about it or something that you agree with or disagree with, send us a voice memo. Let you know what you think, and we'll probably respond to it on air.
Yeah. I saw a lot of people sent pictures of the book that they bought, which is very cool. I'm excited that a lot of you are out there actually reading it. There's a little thread in the MTG Cube Talk Discord channel about it, so people are reading it, and if you want to share your thoughts, yeah, send us a voice memo. You can send it to mail@luckypaper.co, or you can send it to us in Discord or Twitter, find us anywhere, and drop us that message. That it'll actually be like a book club and not just 2 people talking about a book they read, which, does 2 people a club make?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Well, then it was going to be a book club either way. But now it'll be a more full book club if you want to send in your voice memos.
And I'm excited to hear what people think about it. I just finished the book this weekend, and I was a little unsure at the beginning, but then it really picked up, so I don't want to give away too many spoilers.
I'm not done yet, but I'm not going to spoil any of my thoughts yet. I'm
Okay.
save it.
Okay.
Keep them asking for more.
Unspoiled thoughts.
Keep them asking for more. No spoiler season for book club. We also have some mailbag stuff to attend to. Poor Joe sent us a letter ages ago that I said on air I was not going to open unless somebody else sent something in to the P.O. box. Luckily, somebody did finally answer the call. This is a postcard from Porker and Kanadi. It says, "Greetings from the road. I had a work trip to Minnesota, as y'all know, and made the most of it by seeing as many parks and birds as possible afterwards. My favorite was either the purple finch we saw in Seattle, or the bald eagle we spotted in Yellowstone, or the red tail our friend DSB ID'd as being harassed by a crow. Crows rule. What is your bird? Pack one, pick one. Peace, love, and cube. Porker and Kanadi." What's your bird? Pack one, pick one.
I mean, this is an easy one for me. I always say this is a difficult one, but this one is easy. It's the slate-colored dark-eyed junco. It's just a little gray guy. It's got a nice kind of ombre, dark on top, light on the bottom. It's everything you want from a bird. It's elegant. It's understated. Very well designed. I'm gonna start with there. It's very flexible. It fits into any flock, really.
I'm gonna have a basic answer to this because I don't know.
You're gonna say a duck.
I don't know any fancy birds like
That's
you
not
do.
fancy. That's a bird I see outside my window.
I mean, that's
depending on the
it's
season.
fancy to know the name of the little bird you see outside your window every once in a while, and not be like, my favorite bird is the bald eagle or whatever. I guess they did mention that in this card.
Parker did just
I wasn't
say
trying
that.
to say you sound like that, Porker. No, my favorite bird probably is the kakapo.
Okay.
I really love
nothing-
large ground parrot. I think that they're very fun.
Nothing fancy, just this really exotic, strange bird.
But knowing the strange birds is more normal than knowing the
Okay.
normal birds.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Because you watched National Geographic, or you watched David Attenborough get comfortable with kakapo at some point on the internet.
That video is definitely running through my mind a little bit right now.
Definitely.
I think a big ground parrot's just fun.
Big ground parrot.
Yeah.
Shout out to
Kiwi's also cool.
Shout out to red-winged blackbirds, also very elegant with just a little pop of color, just a little splash to make it look intentional. Again, very well-designed bird. Good job with that one.
Thanks for sending in a letter, Porker and Kanadi. Ooh. You almost did a great job. Then you hit the mic stand. It's so hard to be a Foley artist.
Yeah, I'm shout out to Foley artists out there. You're really doing the important work.
A bunch of
I've
magic
dropped
cards fell out.
magic cards everywhere. It's going great. We got Cowboy Joe. Dear Andy and Anthony, I enjoyed your reading my letter on air last time. Here's some cards for y'all. Would love to hear your take on custom cards in Cube. Also, please enjoy these lands. I'm giving them out to all of my attendees of my... It gets smaller as you get to the end.
I love when that happens, yeah.
All the attendees of my... Thank you, Joe, for writing it in.
I'm assuming he's saying Cali Cube champs. Maybe he said Cube event. Who knows?
You want to take a crack at this?
Let's see what we got here. Oh, nice picture of Cowboy Joe. Oh, this is so... You can't read this? I'm giving them to all the attendees of my sold out event.
Sold out event. Excellent.
Yeah.
Congratulations to Joe for selling out Cali Cube champs. We got a split card. Negate. Sorry. We have Megate Nerder. Counter target non-creature spell and destroy target creature. Okay, so it is negate and murder, but it's Megate Nerder. Very good.
And it's a split card.
It's a split card.
No fuse. That would be kind of broken.
That would be something. We got a cool full art island that says Cali Cube champs on the back. Sick. I wonder, are these actually pictures that he's taken? Because these look very natural, I want to say.
Does the artist credit say Joe Anderson?
It does not, but it does label specific places. The Goat Rock, end of Barn Dance Lane, Taylor Mountain, Laguna de Santa Rosa. Yeah, okay, so I think we're just
perhaps
doxing
famous
Joe here.
places in California.
Nice. You love to see it. These are very cool.
Thank you, Joe, for the note, and for the cool basic lands, and for this broken card.
Megate Nerder.
As a split card, I don't think it actually is too broken. Joe asked what we think about custom cards in Cube. You've actually played some custom cards in Cube.
I've dabbled very slightly, and, honestly, I think that the sort of overall feeling about Cube has changed a lot, that they would be more welcome and more approachable now. At the time, it felt a little strange, and it's not something I've gone back to. There are a lot of Magic cards, and I haven't necessarily felt that urge, but, it also just makes the project so much more complex when you're actually talking about designing and printing cards, but I'd be open to it one day in the future, maybe.
Yeah, my general feeling is, like you said, I feel like I'm constantly working uphill to keep my cubes approachable and accessible to a broad audience. The natural tide is to make things harder to understand and more wordy and more complicated, and so introducing cards that are not actual Magic cards, it doesn't say they have to be complicated. Like Murder Negate or Megate Nerder is pretty simple. Like, that's pretty grokkable, so they don't have to fundamentally be complicated, but I do think that, even that simple card, it introduces a lot more questions into an already complicated process. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I think of cube design like, any creative practice, like painting or whatever, and it's totally valid to say, I'm going to, instead of painting on a canvas, I'm going to, take the canvas off and wrap it around some rocks and paint on it then. You can totally change the fundamental question you're asking, and it's still a completely valid creative expression, but it's not the thing I'm interested in. I'm interested in getting good at painting, which is to say getting good at designing with the cards we have available instead of riffing on stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It makes so much sense if you're interested in game design to sort of start in a partial way to use the existing infrastructure of Magic to start experimenting and do some designing. We were actually talking to Zach Barish about this a couple weeks ago, and that's absolutely what he advocated is if you have an idea for a game, figure out a system that you can leverage to test the fundamental thing that your game is about with as little work and effort as possible, which is absolutely how we approach design more broadly.
Approach everything. Evergreen statement to anything creative.
Yeah.
Just get to the thing as quickly as possible and don't fret too much.
But at the same time, I don't want to take my own advice, and if I was going to start doing custom cards, just the experience, that would make less sense to me if I'm playing with a bunch of experienced Magic players that already know all the real cards. I would be more interested in saying okay, let's just design a full set from scratch. That I think would be more rewarding, because then it's not about seeing a real card and a custom card. I keep saying real. I feel like real is maybe not the best term, but a Wizards printed card and your custom card side by side in a pack, that just raises questions which I'm not interested in thinking about.
I think we've also said in the past about custom cards that I think your players are much more likely to be frustrated at you if one of the cards you designed
that's part of what I mean, about having the two side by side.
Is not properly balanced, whereas including a powerful card in a cube, you might catch a little bit of guff, but I think if you design a broken card, they're going to be like, this is so unreasonable, they never even printed it, you just did a bad job. In general, I think people overstate the concern that their players are going to have a bad time, but that's one place you maybe should be concerned about it. If you either make cards that look good but they're actually not that good, or I think more likely in the case of custom cards, make things that are actually broken.
Yeah, honestly, there might be a lot we could talk about here for a whole episode sometime in the future. but we should probably do at least a little experimentation before we do that, or have somebody else on who can speak to that with more context.
Yeah, I mean, I think like all Magic players, I've definitely designed custom cards before, just not for my own cubes. Like a card idea just comes to mind, I'll mock it up and look at it and go, yeah, that's a thing.
I really wanted to make a blue instant that changes the order of 2 items on the stack.
Okay,
There's a thing.
No, you're getting too crazy with it.
It's called Twingle.
You're going wild with it. Anyway, that's how I feel about custom cards in Cube. It's a different thing than the thing I'm interested in, but no less valid or interesting. Any more housekeeping to do, or should we talk a little about the Neoclassical Cube?
I think that's it. I think we should jump into the Neoclassical Cube. You and I have been drafting it quite a bit. I think you even more than me lately, and you've been like very focused on sort of answering some specific questions about it leading up to it being featured at an event for the first time. What are the concrete questions that you're trying to answer?
I'll get to that. Let me start with just...
Okay.
I want to start with just setting the table a little bit for what this cube is more thoroughly. I mean, you heard my little shtick at the beginning. Normally when we talk about a cube in the show, we're just like, it's this. Here's the elevator pitch. I'm going to go into a little more detail, though. We recorded a whole episode about this cube when I first designed it. We'll link that in the show notes. I have no idea how long ago it was. A year? 9 months? Something like that? I'm not sure. But I think my thinking about it has evolved over time and changed, obviously. And so I want to like just explain where I think the cube is at and what the cube is about. And then we can get to the questions that I'm trying to answer. So as stated, this cube is about old school Magic. Most old school cubes that I've seen pretty strictly limit themselves to just old school cards. The Old Border Foil Cube does that. The other cube I'm aware of is Machine Schooling's Cube, whose name actually is escaping me. And that one is actually interesting because it is not restricted to Old Border only. It's restricted to a period of time that includes like 2 or 3 New Border sets. It includes like Mirrodin and Kamigawa and nothing else that's New Border, which is interesting because I think people so often draw like a hard line in the sand at when the frame changed, and that's maybe actually not as meaningful as when like a less visible thing about R&D changed. And so Machine Schooling drew the line, wherever they drew that line.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, especially given the context of like having played a couple cubes recently that are sort of mashups of, new and old Dominaria or new and old Kamigawa. And there is just a huge difference between like, here's a card with a cool effect, and it's a 5-mana 2/2 creature. Whereas now it's like, here's a card with a cool effect. It's a 5-mana 6/6 creature that has
or a 4-mana 5/4 with trample in the case
Yeah.
of, new cards. Yeah.
So I think that like difference in design philosophy and that difference in just like rate, which they have made a choice to just change where that is, did maybe evolve more slowly over time or had a bigger shift later on than that border shift.
Yeah, exactly. So, but most of the cubes I've seen that focus on nostalgia, an old era of Magic, strictly limit themselves to that specific card pool. It's like, yeah, I'm working with these cards, I'm going to do what I can with them, and that's that. In the case of the Old Border Foil Cube, Jeff just cares about the actual card frame itself and allows himself to include retroactively old bordered cards, which is interesting because some of those do feel like they could be old border, and some of them definitely don't fit the like old border R&D patterns, but Jeff includes anyway, which is, everyone's got their own restriction, right? It's all totally valid. For my restriction, I didn't actually want to like follow any hard rules, which is something we've advocated for in this show quite a bit with cubes of any restriction, be it rarity restriction, set restriction, time period restriction, singleton restriction, whatever. Our argument is always, those are often great ways to like get started, but at some point you're going to have your feet under you, you're going to have a shape in front of you, like your cube is coming together, and at that point you might feel like actually you can serve your goals better by breaking a rule and you should just do it. And so in my case, I play any new bordered card that I feel is appropriate, and there are no specific rules on what I can or cannot play. There's some rough guidelines, like I don't, for example, want anything that is a planeswalker that is like too radical and new for me. I don't want any double face cards that's pretty radical and new. I avoid cards that have mechanics that don't feel like they could be printed in old border. But in terms of like power level, some of the most powerful cards in the cube are actually new cards, or cards that are not old school cards, but I feel like they fit the aesthetic and the values of old school Magic.
Could you give some examples of that? Are you thinking of things like Bolus's Citadel, for example?
I am. I'm thinking of things like Bolus's Citadel. I'm thinking of things like Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker, which is a relatively new addition, but I expect to be one of the better cards in the cube.
But again, Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker does kind of still have that old school vibe of like, it doesn't really do a lot on its own. And same with Bolus's Citadel, like there is precedent in things like Future Sight, and Yawgmoth's Will is like obviously a much more powerful card that lets you just do busted stuff, and it feels kind of in that space of Future Sight and Yawgmoth's Will to me for some reason. Or like Necropotence is maybe a better example of just like turning your life into a bunch of card advantage.
Yeah, honestly, I was like, this is just Future Sight plus Channel is what Balls of Citadel is. So because I'm trying to pursue the patterns of old school Magic, but not harshly restricting myself, I have to like come up with a decent understanding of what actually represents old school Magic, right? I think it's very reductive to say like creatures were bad, spells were good, and whatever, or like things were simple instead of complicated, right? Because to your point, I have humility in this cube. I've considered putting Opalescence in this cube alongside Parallax Wave. These cards are not all simple. Like there's definitely some complexity here. So it's not that I'm pursuing just simplicity or just low power level. It's actually much more nuanced than that. And I think definitely since we recorded the first episode about this cube, my thoughts and feelings on this have probably changed. But I usually describe the aesthetics of old school Magic as having powerful, often broken enablers, just like the things that grease the wheels of your deck that, provide mana, provide card advantage. Those things are just broken. And then the actual payoffs, the way you end the game, tend to be pretty middling or clunky or kind of awkward. And so this is a cube where I play something like Mishra's Workshop, which is among the most broken cards ever printed. It's, a whole archetype in Vintage because this card is so powerful. But in this cube, I don't let you play Lodestone Golem or
Blightsteel Colossus.
That's not what you play with Mishra's Workshop. You play
Wormcoil Engine.
What's the 4-mana artifact that is a feature site for colorless cards on top of your deck? Mystic Forge.
Oh, the Mystic Forge.
Yeah, I'm not letting you play Lodestone Golem or Mystic Forge. I'm making you play like Juggernaut and, Masticore and some like much clunkier, weirder, oddball threats. Triskelion is still great, I maintain. That's one of the better artifact payoffs in this cube. So that pattern is definitely one pattern that I'm clinging to. And when I look at a card like Bulbous Citadel or Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker, to me those are both fundamentally enablers. I mean, yes, you can win the game with Bulbous Citadel in a sense that you could just get 10 permanents and kill people with it. But all it lets you do is whatever your deck was already doing, just in a different way by using your life total as a resource and by providing a lot of card advantage. And Kiki Jiki on its face is just a 5-mana 2/2 with haste. It's only good if you're copying stuff, and the things you are copying in this environment are going to be, at best, like Siege Gang Commander or Symbiotic Worm. There is no infinite combo here with Kiki Jiki. There probably is, actually, if you combine 4 or 5 cards. But there's no easy infinite combo here with Kiki Jiki, and there's also no, value that's so difficult to ever come back from. You're making a copy of Symbiotic Worm, which is great, but it feels old school to me to be trying to kill somebody with a copy of Symbiotic Worm.
Or Deranged Hermit.
Deranged Hermit is also one of the better things you can do, for sure. So, where the cube sits today, I have been focusing my energies on trying to corral a reasonable number of broken enablers. I think it is not great when a cube has call it 3 to 5 cards that are way better than everything else. I think when a cube has 12 to 15 or 20 cards that are way better than everything else, that's a great spot because every drafter is going to have a shot at 1 to 3 to 4 of them. They're going to have a chance to take a broken card at some point. And so it's not like you just didn't open power, as it were. It's just that you didn't draft in a way to take advantage of it.
Yeah, that was my experience as well when designing a cube that had a pretty big power disparity. Is even if you don't want just a huge number of cards that are in a much higher power bracket, it is really valuable, in my experience, to have enough of a density of those things that everybody has a shot at a couple so that everybody feels like their deck has a goal and a plan that is a plan that sounds as cool as their opponent's plan, even if their opponent's is a little bit more flexible or consistent.
Yeah. So I just really wanted to collect enough broken enablers. And we've talked about things like Mishra's Workshop. I have Library of Alexandria in here, Tolarian Academy, Gaia's Cradle. Other things that I think are power outliers are things like Tinker, Upheaval, Opposition, Sulfuric Vortex, kind of, only because that deck is very supported and it becomes a very key piece of the deck that it's in. Fastbond, for sure. Fastbond definitely counts in this category as a card you can take early and just go crazy with. Honestly, I might even argue that Parallax Wave, and in this cube, I've definitely fallen into a pretty deep Enchantress theme. Like, Sarah's Sanctum has started to also be kind of messed up. And I've been taking Argothian Enchantress very highly in this cube because of all of the Enchantress payoffs. These are some of the cards that I think are in this tier of, good enough to take early and draft your deck around and are going to give you an engine, some sort of, powerful thing to be doing. I also put all the tutors up here. I run all the tutors in this cube because the other thing I've sort of come to recognize about old school Magic is that I think it was almost fundamentally synergistic. obviously we've had Sly and aggro decks for a long time, and you can argue in the comments about whether or not, an aggro deck counts as a form of synergy. I'm not interested in that discussion. But very few of the cards in old school Magic are standalone self-contained threats that just work regardless of board state and just like do their thing. When you think about some of the best modern threats that we have in your Minsc and Boos and Okos and White Plume Adventurer and all these other premier vintage cube threats, they're just kind of always great. And even the best cards in this cube are rarely always great. Like all those cards I just listed, they're not always great. You have to have a thing to pair them with for them to do anything. Same with Survival of the Fittest, another big sort of build around and key card in this environment. Something like Deranged Hermit or Siege Gang Commander is honestly like the closest to just a card that is great. But the thing is, just, playing lands so you get to like that amount of mana and casting those cards is not going to compete with any of the other decks that have an actual synergistic engine. So even though those cards are pretty close to carrying a game on their own, they are not going to single-handedly just allow your deck to beat a deck that does have a plan.
I can vouch for that, and I can cite my reference of a whole bunch of 1/2s in this cube to back that up.
So anyway, I think it's a fundamentally synergistic environment because I think old school Magic was fundamentally more synergistic because cards had higher ceilings and lower floors, and building a deck that could get the ceilings out of cards more often was part of the challenge of drafting. So for that reason, I've included basically all of the reasonable tutors in this environment because, drafting is hard, and I think it's hard to draft highly synergistic decks or combo decks, and I want to make that a little bit easier and give people, a way to actually make the mind over matter combo work or go infinite with Earthcraft and Mobilization. So I include Enlightened Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Gamble, Worldly Tutor. Is that all of them? I mean, I guess you can count things like Tinker and Transmute Artifact as a kind of tutor. It goes and finds the specific thing you need. In that sense, like, Survival of the Fittest is also a tutor of sorts. I'll take this opportunity to mention that, as always, we're going to have a cards mentioned page on our website for this podcast episode. So if you don't know all these old school cards and you want to follow along with the conversation, we're not going to read all the rules text out loud because for people that do know, it gets really repetitive. Honestly, for people that don't know, it gets repetitive. So I think it's much easier to read a card than have it read to you and understand it. So check out the link in the show notes for the cards mentioned if you want to follow along. So anyway, fundamentally synergistic decks, right? And the example there is, like I mentioned, Upheaval is a build around here. Upheaval is great. It's a premier card that I think is reasonable to take early and build your whole deck around. You can make it one of the best cards in the entire cube. It doesn't do anything on its own. And if you draft the deck that can make Upheaval work, I want you to be able to find it. So I'm giving you all the tutors that are reasonable to have at your disposal to make that happen. I also have introduced a more robust Goblin package. I've had Goblin Matron and Goblin Recruiter in here for a while, but frankly, it was really just a way to go and get Goblin Welder and Goblin Engineer in the Welder deck. I wanted some redundancy for those otherwise really important cards in that deck. Or it's also totally reasonable, I think, to play a Goblin Matron just if you have a Siege Gang Commander in your deck. Just to go get a good card in the late game, I think is also completely reasonable. You asked me the questions I've been asking myself over the past few weeks as we've been drafting this cube, right?
Yeah, the questions you've been asking and sort of what you've been trying to learn by doing this sort of more focused playtesting.
Yeah. I had a couple goals. One goal was to cut 40 to 50 cards. This cube...
Okay, so you had just kind of like a free form count, right?
Yeah, and I might go back to that eventually. To be honest, I've had it at 410, 405-ish for a while, and I kept, whenever we were drafting with just 8 people or whatever, I kept finding myself checking all the cards that weren't in the cube and being like, oh, I don't want to miss this in the draft, and then sneaking it into a pack and taking some random card out.
Wow, this is an incredible confession you're hearing here.
Parnell would have my head on a stake for doing this, but I mean, that to me just tells me that, as much as I like to be loosey-goosey and embrace just making the cube bigger if you want, that's not actually my design. That's not actually my design sensibility. I just want to play with the fun cards. I don't want to not open Library of Alexandria and the Neoclassical Cube. That's just not what I'm here for. So for that reason, I've been trying to cut down to exactly 360, and so just making 40 to 50 cuts is already a pretty big challenge in and of itself. I also wanted to make sure that I, as much as I could, kind of dialed in some of the decks that were already present. The most unfair Storm combo deck has been a deck that has been, as people can probably imagine, difficult to balance. Patrick requested Brain Freeze for that deck because Patrick likes to play as many blue cards as possible and was trying to build, essentially a Storm deck, but all the Storm payoff cards were not in blue, and he was like, give us a Brain Freeze. And I had not included it because I suspected it would be kind of broken, and I think 2 or 3 drafts it was in for, and it won every single one of them, which is obviously that's completely anecdotal. I mean, you could just have a great deck that has Brain Freeze in it and just get mana screwed a couple times, but the qualitative experience of those games was very much that nothing mattered except for Brain Freeze, and it was so easy to kill somebody with Brain Freeze because it was designed and balanced fundamentally for a 60-card format. Now you're playing it in 40 cards. It was just too good to have Brain Freeze as the Storm payoff. So that proved to be problematic. I ended up replacing it with Empty the Warrens, which has actually been, I think, much better balanced. I drafted the Storm deck just last night in this cube, and I went 2-1 and lost in the finals. I think my deck was very good. I had almost all the tutors I just listed. I had Vampiric, Demonic, and Mystical Tutor in my mostly blue-black deck, all to find my various Storm pieces and wheels and whatever I needed. Yawgmoth's Will is another card that's worth taking early. But just remembering some more of the power outliers. Yogg's Will, it's great. The deck was really good, but also I didn't have any game that was a total blowout, which is the sign, I think, of the deck just not being super fun. I even had one game where I did go turn 1 Fast Bond into play 3 more lands and cast Windfall on the play, and I had mulled to 6.
It's a pretty good start.
It's a really good start, and I did eventually win that game, but it wasn't just over immediately, right? Like, I drew some more cards, and then it's still a pretty clunky deck, and drafting a Storm deck is hard in the first place, and when you don't have access to all of the best payoffs and all the best modern Storm cards, it is harder to actually make that thing happen. The games were all close. So many games came down to, like, do I have 1 mana I need this turn? Do I have the 1 life I need? I went to 1 life so many times on Fast Bond, and, like, won just barely on 1 life multiple times. So I feel like that deck is at an okay place. I think that deck is fundamentally, I'm thinking, forward to Steel City Cube, I think it's one of the easiest decks to train wreck with, and I don't think there's any way for me to, as a cube designer, really fix that. I think some people are going to come in and see, I don't know, Yogg's Will or Time Spiral and just think that they're going to go all in on Storm and not know the shape and texture of an old school Storm deck rather than a modern one, because the old school decks, I think, are much more about attrition. My deck last night, I would call it a Storm deck. I was playing both Tendrils of Agony and Empty the Warrens, but I also
did also have other win conditions, though.
Yes, I also had Megrim combo. So I play Megrim, which is an enchantment that every time your opponent discards a card, they lose 2 life. To me, it's like an iconic kitchen table build-around card where I remember seeing it as a kid and just being like, I'm going to build a deck that makes my opponent discard all their cards, and they'll have no life and no cards. What could go wrong? I also run a creature.
You're really the opposite of me. I'm the one over here casting Tooth and Nail to get Archon of Hexproof and...
Yeah, I'm never interested in protecting myself. I just want to do bad things to my opponent.
Everything has indestructible and Hexproof and you can't hurt me anymore. That was my kitchen table experience.
Yeah. I also run Fell Spectre, which is essentially a creature version of Megrim, which is a great example of a modern card that I played last night, and my opponent was like, I had never seen that card before. It's so cool, because it's essentially a callback to Megrim on a 4-drop 1/3 flyer. So yeah, I had other win conditions, right? I was either going to Storm off, or I was going to play 1 or 2 Megrims and then cast a Wheel of Fortune or a Windfall, and I actually had Cephalid Coliseum in there too. I really wanted to get a kill with Cephalid Coliseum. It didn't end up happening, but that was one of my goals. That was actually one of the ways I could have killed you if I had 1 more mana on that one game. I was 1 mana short of being able to Cephalid Coliseum you out. So close. So anyway, I expect there's going to be people that are going to draft this deck and say, this deck's no good, it's bad, because they will have drafted it naively, let's say. I don't want to say badly, but I think it's a hard deck to draft, a hard deck to pilot, and I think that part of the charm of old school Magic is a higher tolerance for those kind of fail cases.
Yeah, and I think it's less risky, to be honest, in this cube to have those kinds of experiences, because that very much is the experience you're presenting and setting people up for, and being like, yeah, there are like color hosers and big power outliers, and your opponent might do something that you have a really difficult time answering, and as long as people's expectations are set up appropriately, that's not necessarily a problem.
Yeah.
And just when you're like picking up the cards, obviously everything looks very different if you're used to playing modern Magic, and that just puts you, I think, in a state of being a little bit more open-minded about this is not going to necessarily be the kind of experience you're used to.
Yeah, and there are definitely some things about old school Magic that by modern standards we would consider like, kind of out of bounds. Like, there are plenty of ways in this cube to mess with your opponent's mana, and I also still play a full cycle of bounce lands. You vindicated my Ravnica bounce land last night.
Did. Still smiling about it.
That can happen in this cube, and
then you needed just 1 more mana a few turns later. Remember
true.
that?
I did need 1 more mana a few turns later. Now, could you have just vindicated the Megrim and then never even been in that problem at all?
I had a disenchant in my hand after you cast Wheel of Fortune. It was no problem.
So yeah, you can vindicate or wasteland your Ravnica bounce land. That can happen in this environment. There's Thalia as well as Glow Rider and Vryn Wingmare to make like a kind of punishing Lock Hate Bear's deck. There's also Winter Orb and Static Orb and Sphere of Resistance. Like, there's a lot of just like stuff that we almost never see in Modern Magic because the game has just evolved to focus on specific aspects that powers that be decided are more in line with the kind of gameplay they're seeking. But Old School Magic was not like that. I mean, this is something that Richard Garfield has talked about before, that, you know, he didn't mean for every deck to be about creatures. And something that I think this cube highlights really well is there's a lot of decks, not a lot, but let's call it 2 to 3 different whole archetypes that can basically operate on 0 or very few creatures. And that means that, like, removal is a sideboard card in this cube sometimes. I've definitely left pretty good removal out of my main deck in plenty of circumstances because I'm like, well, I need a cut, and there's a 30% chance, 20% chance my opponent is going to be playing no creatures that I can remove with this card, so that's something I think a lot of people are not used to.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's one of my favorite things about this cube, is that to me is such a more compelling narrative. The idea of, like, I'm a wizard. What do you do? I summon a bunch of creatures and I try and attack you with them. What do you do? Same thing. It's like, it's obviously the game that I enjoy, and like my main cube is all about creature combat. It's like gameplay I enjoy.
We both love creature combat here.
But the narrative is also very compelling to be like, I'm a wizard. What do you do? I don't know. I got these little like artifacts and I'm going to like put them into this weird little machine that's going to make your head explode. Isn't that cool? It's like, yeah, I'd like that. Or, you know, I'm just about trying to shoot you with lightning bolts directly until you die. That just is, I think, much more the old school narrative that I find very appealing aesthetically. And I really also do just enjoy how dynamic the decks are, how the strategies are so different and so committed to doing some particular thing that it does make sideboarding honestly, like, in some ways easier, but also just like more rewarding.
I think it's easier and it matters a lot more.
Yeah, like against you and both of my opponents last night, actually, I was just like, yeah, you don't have that many creatures. I will like keep one removal spell in for your one thing, but I'm happily going to just board in things that will interact with your artifacts and enchantments. Honestly, I was main decking a lot of those already, or just like try and change up my deck to be a little bit more aggressive to try and get around things. Like, it felt like sideboarding was really, really meaningful, and that's a funny thing to say considering how much this cube feels sort of inaccessible, in the fact that you have to have like, or it rewards having a lot of intimate knowledge of the way that these cards work together.
I mean, frankly, there's just a lot of wrong text on the cards because the text has changed, and as much as I like accessibility, I think commitment to the bit here, commitment to the aesthetic, I think rises above the idea of running like a modern mystical tutor that has the correct Oracle text, you know?
But that sort of entry level of, I can very much see where sideboarding matters, and I'm going to draft differently the second and third time I do this, I think is makes for a rewarding experience, potentially even for some players that are less enfranchised in this kind of Magic.
That is the most compelling defense I had ever heard of color hosers, which I think was something Mark Rosewater said on an episode of Drive to Work, is that he was like, oh, color hosers, they're great because the newest worst player in the world knows you're playing blue, I'll bring in my protection from blue creature, right? And there's a lot of value to like having very clear flags. If you look at the game from a broader sense, there's a lot of value to that, like teaching you that sometimes cards are a lot better, whereas in a card,
it's like, there's a path in this grove. I guess I can get into the grove. Oh, I found something cool here. Now I know I can get to this from other ways, but I wouldn't have gotten there if there wasn't that like initial path to lead me. Yeah,
and by comparison, you know, your regular cube and my Bun Magic cube, all the sideboarding there is pretty much like tiny edges, which is still interesting, but it is so much less rewarding because you don't get to be like, I drew my Silver Bullet card that I knew was going to matter in this matchup because of what your deck was trying to do. Even though I didn't see the card that I actually brought this card in for, but I knew it must be in there somewhere. Like, you don't get that kind of like moment. You're just like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, take this card that's, you know, 48% power level in this matchup out for this card that's 54% power level.
Yeah, it's like, I saw shifts. A lot of X1s, so I think that my divided burn spell is bigger than my 3 damage burn spell by like a small percentage. So sure, I'll make that adjustment. But
play Electrolyze over Volcanic Hammer or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever play Volcanic Hammer. It's a bad example, but, you know.
Lightning Strike.
Sure, there you go. So yeah, I like that aspect of this too. I think sideboarding does matter a lot, and something that I said during our little pre-draft speech last night that the 3-0 player eventually thanked me for at the end of the draft was I said, disenchants are very good. They're main deckable here, which I think leans into that fact that there are multiple decks in this cube that don't have creatures. You need to have some permanents in play for the most part. It's hard to win the game without any permanents in play that aren't lands. So there is a whole Artifact Matters deck. I would say there's actually kind of 2 whole Artifact Matters decks in most drafts. The combination of Workshop and Academy and Welder and all of the cards that are good with all of those cards. Upheaval and Wildfire are basically artifact cards in a sense. Tinker's an artifact card. There's a lot of Artifact Matter stuff going on. So that's like a whole theme and a half. And then I've also ended up pushing really hard on Enchantress. This is actually a theme that was not in this cube initially at all. Then I tried adding kind of like all the Enchantress effects. So I added Argothian as well as Verduin Enchantress and the color-shifted Mesa Enchantress, along with Enchantress's Presence, and drafted that deck a few times and felt like just playing cards like Verdurn Enchantress and Mesa Enchantress was just so bad. They're 3-mana 0-1s. Like, their stat line is laughable even for old cards. They're 0-2s. Don't write me any emails.
They play well with humility, sort of.
Well, they do lose the ability to draw you cards, so not
you
that
draw the
well.
one card when you cast humility.
And what I ended up doing was just actually cutting the 2 bad Enchantress effects and keeping the good ones. Argothian Enchantress is the best by far. It's 2 mana, it's got Shroud, it's fantastic. And Enchantress's Presence is great because it also is an enchantment itself, obviously. Those 2 cards plus Replenish are really like, and Sarah's Sanctum. Those 4 cards are kind of like the pillar of the Enchantress deck. And then around it, there's so many things you can do with enchantments that there's actually quite a few different styles of decks there. You know, you can be a like full-on enchantment control deck where you're playing Humility and Mobilization, and I even added Planar Collapse recently, where you're just basically playing a bunch of, control cards and using your enchantments to like dominate the board. You can play an enchantment sort of combo deck. I've done like an Oath of Druids, Mind Over Matter Enchantress deck before, where it had enough enchantments to just like ramp things out, and then key enchantments like those 2 to then eventually like have a combo going on. I really want somebody to do the Reanimator Enchantress deck because Recurring Nightmare is so good with the Enchantress effects because it just keeps drawing you cards over and over again.
Now you've taken this chance from me.
I mean, I haven't done it yet. You can do it. Why can't you? Why haven't I taken it from you by saying it out loud?
Now you've told everybody.
I just want someone to do it. And yeah,
as a recurring
necromancy.
Nightmare enjoyer, I would very much like to try that.
So there's a lot of things you can do with it, but that like core engine is there. So because of those 2 decks, the disenchants are hugely valuable. And the other thing about these cards is, there's a much bigger delta between the best and worst card in this deck than there are in many cubes. Part of that is that a lot of these cards are just situationally good, and the delta is between their average case or their fail case and the best case of other cards. Like, Juggernaut is not a very good card. Like, it's been a passable uncommon in retail limited. It's just not very powerful. Now, there's actually a fair number of walls here. That text matters because that's a little bit of old school Magic for you. And also, again, I have Tolarian Academy and Mishra's Workshop to try and make Juggernaut a passable card, but there's also going to be some games where you're just playing Juggernaut and casting it on 4 and, doing your thing. By comparison, some other cards are extremely powerful and the whole game revolves around them. Cards like Opposition, like, you better have a disenchant for Opposition. My opponent in the finals last night played it on Game 3. I didn't know they had it in their deck. I said, do you mind if I look at a picture of my deck? And I did on my phone, and then I conceded because I had nothing to do in the face of an opposition with I think 4 or 5 creatures in play. There was just no way I was ever getting out of that. So because of that big power delta and because of how prevalent these card types are, having that 1 or 2 disenchants is really important.
Yeah, I did literally the same thing yesterday, looking at the deck pick and then scooping to something.
So I want to talk a little bit more about Kiki Jiki. This is a recent addition. It's only been in for 2 drafts. You played it in this draft, and I want to hear more about what your experience was like playing with this card, because I think a lot of people's first impressions when they hear about me putting Kiki Jiki in this cube is that that card is too powerful and also like feels new. And I want to emphasize, Kamigawa was an old set. This was not that long after the card frame change, so it is quite an old card. It's much closer to these cards than it is to modern cards if you were to plot them on a timeline. But I also see how people like it's still a staple in a lot of powerful cube lists that care about combos and things like Splinter Twin. I want to know what your experience was playing with it, and then also how you feel about it in this environment.
I mean, my experience of playing with it was my deck wasn't necessarily great. It wasn't super optimized to take advantage of this. I was kind of just trying to, I saw some like pretty good, I saw Thalia and some other pretty good white creatures early in the draft and was thinking, okay, I haven't really tried to draft like an aggressive deck here, and then ended up feeling like red was kind of open, so I was just trying to kind of like draft a Boros aggro deck. But when I got CGN Commander, I want to say somewhere middle of Pack 2, that's a card I'm always excited to play, and started trying to build towards that. Kiki Jiki feels great with Siege Gang Commander, obviously, and then also picked up a Recurring Nightmare, which also just sort of feeds into like trigger a bunch of ETBs.
Did you get to make a copy of a thing and then sacrifice it with Recurring Nightmare to get a thing back? Did that ever happen?
I did not, but I did fling some goblins that were the copies with Kiki Jiki. And like all of this, I think fits with your description of the other types of enablers versus payoffs, where you're not playing Kiki Jiki and then comboing off immediately. You're playing Kiki Jiki and then getting some incremental value, and that just really feels in line with everything you're doing, and the fact that it is a 2-mana 2/2. If your opponent has any removal at all, they can deal with it, and it's not going to kill you on the turn it hits the table. So yeah, I mean, it feels appropriate to me.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm curious to hear after Pittsburgh if people end up groaning about it, if it ends up being too good.
I mean, I think that the best it can be is very good. Like, if you were out there, making a copy of Avalanche Riders every turn, or Siege Gang's great, but you could also be making a bunch of squirrels with Deranged Hermit. And if you just had a lot more payoffs that you could be confident that you were always going to be ahead on board with something that had a meaningful ETB, then I think it would be very strong. But honestly, I think that optimized deck is really hard to get to because, there are some things that we take for granted in Modern Magic, like Enter the Battlefield triggers, which there just aren't as many of in here.
There really aren't. It's true. Like, digging for like good, just cheap little efficient creatures that have Enter the Battlefield abilities that matter. I'm playing a couple of new ones. Like, I'm playing Elvish Visionary, for example, which is a new card. It wasn't printed in Old Border, but I love what it does with Wirewood Symbiote too much. And also, I wanted a couple more little cheap creatures that cantripped on ETB, because some of the best ones in old school Magic are like Mana War, Wall of Blossoms.
Cool. I mean, honestly, I would have loved a Mogg War Marshal. I think I passed that over some fixing, which is also important, but like at the end of the day, that would have made my deck so much better.
That's also scarily good with Kiki Jiki, the Mogg War Marshal. You get to make 3 goblins a turn, only one of which you have to sacrifice, which is a pretty good rate, especially in a cube like this.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how that goblin package works out. So far, the goblin package has been split between drafters in every draft. Nobody has just gotten all of the goblin stuff. You had a fair bit of it last night, but not all of it. And James drafted it a week ago and split it with Emma. So nobody has gotten sort of the full package yet, and I'm curious to see if that ends up being a little too dominant, if it ends up working. I'm also, my hope is that these are not too narrow. I initially resisted putting more goblin kindred support in, and it's something that Bones, oft mentioned judge and head judge of Steel City Cube, encouraged me to do, because Bones is a known...
I think you just say head judge of Cube at this point.
Head judge of Cube. Bones is a known goblin enjoyer and encouraged me to put in more goblin stuff. And my concern was just that I want to avoid an on-rails archetype. And I'm hoping that by having Goblin Welder and Goblin Engineer being 2 of the fetchable goblins that go in a deck that is not fundamentally a goblin deck, right? Like, that's an artifact deck that happens to have 2 goblins in it, but you'll also happily play Goblin Matron and Goblin Recruiter to go get them. I honestly think adding Kiki Jiki in means that you can have a deck who has Goblin Matron, and maybe the only other goblin is Kiki Jiki, or maybe you have one other thing as a fail case if you already drew Kiki Jiki, just so you're not playing a 3-mana 1/1. But like, it's really just a way to go get Kiki Jiki to then make your deck a Kiki Jiki deck that is also not all about goblins. And then hopefully there's a third deck that is, you got all the goblin stuff, and you're just doing it all. You're using Goblin Lackey to put in Siege Gang Commander, and then next turn you're putting in Goblin Matron to go 2-rep Kiki Jiki to make copies of Siege Gang Commander. Like, I hope that happens sometimes. I don't want it to happen every time, and I don't quite know if that's where this is yet.
That does sound cool.
I want to address Reanimator briefly. This is an archetype that for a long time I think was one of the best in the cube, and not much has changed about it, except that I think people have started to respect it more. I often see people saying, I main decked this Phyrexian Furnace begrudgingly, and it ended up being great in most of my matchups. The graveyard matters a lot here, and there's not great grave hate in old school Magic. I'm playing Phyrexian Furnace and Tormod's Crypt. I'm playing Withered Wretch, the world's worst scavenging ooze. End of list? Question mark? There might be a couple other things floating around here, but for the most part, it's like committal sideboard cards you have to like go pick. You have to go pick up a Withered Wretch or a Tormod's Crypt or a Phyrexian Furnace to actually deal with your opponent's threats, or you can exile them. We do have Swords to Plowshares and stuff like that, which I think is real.
Right. Also, there's the, Faith's Fetters and Oblivion Ring type of effects, which feel very relevant against the Reanimator deck.
And those are new, and I've opted to add those because they are exile removal and because they work with the Enchantress effects. That's one place where I have, strayed a little bit into Modern Magic. There's not really any precedent for Oblivion Ring style effects in old school Magic, and Lorwyn was a couple years later.
Is that really true? I guess pacifism kind of like set a light precedent that they logically expanded on, but maybe not as early as I realized.
I think the first Oblivion Ring effect was Oblivion Ring, and it was in Lorwyn.
Lorwyn?
Yeah, I don't know of any that were prior to that. Sound off in the comments if I'm missing one.
There are comments?
There are comments, yeah, don't look at
Okay.
them. But that Reanimator deck gets all of the best enablers, right? You can go Dark Ritual, Entomb, Exhume on turn 1, or Dark Ritual, Entomb, Reanimate. Like, I've seen that line happen plenty of times. The thing is, what you're getting back is like Visar the Dreadful, or Scion of Darkness, or Verdant Force, or, one of these cards.
You say that like having a Verdant Force is not peak Magic.
No, it is peak Magic. I love it. I built this cube, Anthony. That's exactly what I want. I'm just saying that the terror of casting Dark Ritual, Entomb, Exhume, people are used to getting Atraxid, or Grizzle Branded, or Archon of Cruelty, and that's just not what these games are. Like, you can go get your Verdant Force, and your opponent can still just have a Swords of Plowshares, and the game just goes on. Like, you just got 3-for-1 by your own deck, basically. But regardless, because of those powerful enablers, I do still think it's one of the better decks, but I think people are starting to respect it more with the Grave Hate. So I feel like that's in an okay place. I'll be, again, curious to see how that one performs at Steel City Cube. I want to talk briefly about some things I had to cut. I did have to cut the cycling deck. The cycling deck in this cube was pretty much entirely because of my affection for the card Astral Slide. For those who don't know, this is a 3-mana white enchantment. And to say when you cycle a card or whenever anybody cycles.
Whenever any player cycles.
Okay, it is any player. Whenever any player cycles a card, you get to exile a creature until end step, and then it comes back. That can be your creature, your opponent's creature. So you can use it as like an engine piece to re-trigger your own end of the battlefield abilities. Like, you can have a cycling land, an Eternal Witness, and a Astral Slide, and you just get to, do that as much as you want, keep drawing cards, keep blanking attacks. You also get to just kind of use it as a control card and exile your opponent's attackers if they would threaten you. You keep blanking them every turn if you can keep drawing cards with cycling. I love that card. And that archetype, frankly, could not hang in this cube with the power level that we're playing at. I'm sad to say. What it came down to, what I kept explaining to people when I ended up cutting it, was just compare the hoops you have to jump through for Astral Slide to be good versus Parallax Wave, which is still a build around. Like, Parallax Wave is not good on every board state, but it is such a higher ceiling and less work to set up that every deck that was an Astral Slide deck was just as good if you cut the Astral Slide and had the Parallax Wave instead.
I mean, you say that it has a higher ceiling. I think it has a much higher floor. It's like Astral Slide can blank some attackers is kind of like the worst case. But,
the floor on Astral Slide is
also
nothing.
can just not have anything to cycle, and then it does
Yes.
nothing. Whereas Parallax Wave can definitely blank a couple of attackers.
Yeah, when it's at its worst, Parallax Wave buys you a turn or two. You get to exile your opponent's board, and then it comes back, and then they attack you a couple turns later, which is still not nothing. Where Astral Slide can actually be nothing. So I ended up cutting that along with a lot of the cycling cards that were in there largely to support that theme. And when I had Astral Slide, I also included Lightning Rift, and I included Astral Drift, the new Astral Slide. I had a bunch of cards kind of supporting this theme, and I ended up cutting all of them. Most notably, I also cut all of the copies of Ash Barrens. I used to have, at some point I had 16 copies, and I went down to 12, and I went down to 10. Then I just cut them all when I was looking for cuts to make this cube work. I still like the concept of a very Ash Barrens dense mana base, and I actually have a whole other cube I've been brewing that I basically took that whole mana base and just dropped into there because I enjoyed playing with a bunch of copies of Ash Barrens. I think it was fun. This is just not the right cube for it, I've decided. And instead, the lands are all single. The whole cube is singleton now. There's not anything breaking singleton. And the cycling deck just really couldn't hang, unfortunately.
Sad to see, but it makes sense for all those reasons.
The last thing I want to talk about is just my approach to the burn deck. From the beginning, I've wanted this cube to have a burn deck. And by burn, I mean a burn deck. It's got some creatures, but it is primarily killing you with lightning bolts, etc. to the face. And this has also been a tricky thing to balance because there's a bit of a pattern in a lot of cubes of players just not wanting to play what they perceive as the basic aggro deck. This is famous in the Magic Online Vintage Cube that Cedric Phillips just queues up and drafts mono white aggro every single time and always has a great deck because in a random pot on MTGO, 7 out of the 8 players are not going to want to play mono white under any circumstances, no matter what you pass them, because that's not why they queued in to play Vintage Cube.
They want to be doing the splashy big Reanimator stuff or having these powerful planeswalkers or whatever.
Right, and I think that deck in this cube is just the burn deck. And I want to be clear, I think drafting and playing a burn deck is an art. I think it requires a lot of strategy. I think it is difficult. I don't think it is just mindless, cast bolts at your opponent's face. But I think that's a perception of it. And so For a while there, I think this was the best deck because most people didn't want to draft it, and if you decided you wanted to be that person that night, you would get pretty much everything. I shaved a couple cards from it when I cut this cube down to 360, and one of the cards I shaved, I still kind of miss, but was quietly one of the most powerful cards in the cube, and that's Price of Progress.
Yeah.
I had that in there as, like, I think that and, like, Sulfuric Vortex are the two cards that scream burn deck. Like,
It's got a very, very high ceiling in the amount of damage it can do.
Yes. I had a couple matchups where I was playing against Price of Progress and old past drafts of this cube where I was just like, if you draw it, I lose. Like, I have...
And I'm at 8.
I have... even more. Like, I have 12 non-basics in my deck, so it's like, yeah, if you draw it, I'm going to lose. So I'm just going to have to play as if you're never going to draw Price of Progress because I cannot beat
Zerrin
it.
Orb as your safety valve.
I mean, I did... That's part of the reason Zerrin Orb is in the cube, is because I did want there to be counterplay against Price of Progress. It's part of the reason that Chain of Vapor is in the cube. Chain of Vapor is play against Price of Progress in a sense. I mean, you can at least control how much life you're losing. It gives you a knob to turn of how much do I want to sacrifice lands to not have to die to this Price of Progress, and giving you that knob I think is relevant. But I ended up cutting it because specifically for Steel City Cube, I think people that don't know the cube and don't see it coming, it's only going to be feel bads. And so I actually think I might re-add this card after Steel City Cube when we're back in our local play group and have it be the burn boogeyman that it always has been. But I did want to get this out of the way for Steel City Cube because I don't foresee any good feelings coming from the casting of Price of Progress in Pittsburgh.
I see where you're at. Now you've just given them to something to be disappointed by.
I saw your head where you'd figured out how Chain of Vapor can work against Price of Progress. You got to target your own stuff every time, and then you can sacrifice a land copy. You got to bounce your own stuff and sacrifice lands.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is if the burn deck is purely a burn deck, you need something to be able to target. So hopefully,
if you target their thing, you can't copy it. So then it's just over. So
yes.
you have to have your own things in play to bounce, and that can bounce any non-land permanent, not just creatures, which is one of the cool things about Chain of Vapor.
Yeah,
but sneaking in one last cheeky editing booth comment here. I'm 99% certain you can just copy Chain of Vapor, targeting the same non-land permanent the first copy targeted, because you don't care if they resolve. All you care about is sacrificing the lands to copy it in this instance. So you just need one thing you're willing to bounce, and you can then sacrifice as many lands as you want. What a funny, cool card. It's at least, like I said, it's a knob. I'm not even sure it's a good knob, but at least, you have a break in case of fire, break in case of emergency
now
box.
You upheavaled me instead of just killed me right out. Great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes the burn deck is very committal, and it's basically expecting and hoping to get to that point.
Yeah, it's like your deck can count to 20. Can it count to 26? Maybe not.
Anyway, that is the Neoclassical Cube over the past 2-3 months as I've been preparing for Steel City Cube, which I also don't want to overstate. Like, I'm not worried about this event. Like, the cube will be fine. If I had not done any of this work beforehand, it would also have been fine. I just think that it's an opportunity to, like, put my best foot forward for this cube that has been an amorphous blob for a little bit, and so I'm just taking this as an opportunity to try and cut it down and lean it up a little bit so everybody can get the sort of distilled neoclassical experience at Steel City Cube. I also know that Greg, the organizer, Genrovo Horror, has flipped a switch in Hedron Network, which I think every cube event organizer should flip in the Hedron Network, which just does not allow players to ever draft the same cube.
Yeah, it's weird that switch is... That's a good switch.
According to Gwen, that switch has always been there, and everyone else has wanted that switch to be turned off, and I think it's so much better that it's on. I don't think the primary concern is people like farming the same cube for points to try and make top 8, but it's nice that you prevent that too. More importantly, it means you don't have to go and add every cube you've played to your want to ignore list between every single round, which is what you have to do currently.
For me as a player, it just means I can just go in full random and have a better experience.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely.
Last question is, should we touch on the aesthetic quality of this cube at all? Is that important to mention?
Oh, the fact that all the cards are trashed?
The fact that you play it unsleeved and you're going to be sleeving it for the first time at this event.
I'm not thrilled about it, but also I have started to come to terms with the fact that I will need to sleeve this cube eventually if I want to continue to play it.
At some point, these cards will be mostly played, and then they will be all played, and you will not be able to play them anymore.
I should be curious to know, how many times have this cube has been drafted since I started it? I'm going to guess like 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen at most, which is not that many.
Look at that memory jar there.
Yeah, here's the memory jar that I had to cut.
This talisman on your desk.
This memory jar... I had to replace it with a different heavily worn memory jar because this one lost a corner. And I was like, well, that's about as marked as marked gets.
Never forget the memory jar.
Yeah, I mean, The card sleeves exist for a reason. The cards get damaged.
We did a test. We wanted to find out, do card sleeves matter? And yes.
This has been a long This is a long Tolarian Community College video to tell you that yes, your cards will get damaged if you play them and riffle shuffle them on picnic tables without card sleeves. So I think my goal for this cube is to play it a bunch unsleeved. This is the spirit of the cube. This is what I want to do with it. And if cards get too damaged, I'm going to pull them out and put them in the box of cards that have been retired for being too damaged. And eventually, if I feel like we're on the cusp of like too much of the cube being too damaged for it to even be playable anymore, I'll probably have to sleeve it at that point.
Sorry, you don't get to play Price of Progress anymore. Somebody riffled it a little too hard.
But at that point, I get to bring all those cards that were too played to get played back in and replace the versions I had to replace them with. So this memory jar will maybe someday see play again. Maybe I'll put it in for Steel City Cube. I mean, it's funny. I bought a couple of heavily played cards for this cube recently, and one of them was explicitly marked by the seller as not sleeve playable. Like, is so damaged.
And you said, no problem. I'm not going to be playing them in sleeves.
But their point was that it's so damaged that it is still going to be identifiable even in a sleeve.
Right.
And it is in the bottom 20% of most damaged cards in this cube. So, I'm sleeving it for competitive, viability as Steel City Cube, but I think almost all the cards in this cube would also qualify as too damaged for sleeve playability anyway. But, at some point, they're all damaged. So, how can you possibly tell which card is damaged when they're all damaged? It feels good to riffle shuffle Magic cards.
It does, actually, yeah. It took me a couple drafts to get used to it again, but...
It feels good. All right. That's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. If you want to participate in our book club, you still have time. Order a copy of The Beauty of Games by Frank Lance. I'll put a link in the show notes one last time. We'll be talking about it in 2 episodes from now, if I have my dates right. Yeah, I do. 2 episodes from now. And send in any voice memos if you have your own thoughts to share about the book. I promise it's not that scary. It's very easy. Pull out your phone. Both iOS and Android have built-in voice recording apps. Just, record yourself and send that to mail at luckypaper.co or find us on Discord or Twitter. It's Bloomborough spoiler season, so we're talking about Bloomborough mechanics on the next episode probably. This survey's not going to be out by the time this episode airs, but keep your eyes peeled for that. I also got to get better. I never sent an email from Modern Horizons 3, and I also don't think we posted it on the subreddit. And a couple people pointed out, like, you didn't do this thing, and it's like, it's hard to remember. There's too many of these things going on.
Isn't that Porker's job?
Yeah. Is it Porker's job? That's a really interesting question. I don't think we have explicitly said that is Porker's job. I've done a lot of the Reddit posting in the past.
Yeah.
Because I think Porker...
Maybe we need a Reddit master.
Porker is not Reddit pilled. Well, it was interesting on the episode of 10,000 Posts that it became very clear that Devin runs all the social media, too. Like, producing the show includes all of it, right? Like, you actually produce the audio, you post it on social media, you, do all that work, which, interesting insight into a more professional question mark podcast.
Writing Twitter's fine. Reddit posts stresses me out. You got to word things so carefully and not make a typo.
You know that you're going to get picked over with a fine-tooth comb. You're definitely in the spotlight when you're making a Reddit post. Yeah, for sure. Anyway, all of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards. I've been speaking to microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of Cube, and thank you for the gift of friendship.
Thank you for the gift of Cube and dinner, which I'm looking forward to.
That's fine. You don't have to like my friendship. It's fine. Whatever.
And friendship.
No, it's fine. I don't want you to say it just because I said it. That doesn't.
Now I can't say that.